The courtroom was filled with a heavy silence, broken only by the rustling of papers and the occasional cough from someone in the audience. And in the center of it all stood a woman who carried the unbearable weight of an accusation she knew was false. Her hands were cold, though she tried to keep them steady, and her heart thudded in her chest as she felt dozens of eyes pressing against her, judging her without words, their whispers weaving through the air like sharp needles, each one pricking at her already fragile calm. And while she stood tall, inside she could feel the unease tightening around her, making it hard to breathe. The man who had accused her sat with quiet confidence, his shoulders straight, his expression calm, as though he had already won, and that composure unsettled her more than the whispers, because it showed how much he believed the lies he had told, how much he counted on others believing them too. She glanced around and saw the jury exchanging quiet looks, their faces impossible to read, some showing doubt, others showing suspicion, and every one of those silent exchanges only deepened the pit in her stomach, for she realized she was not only fighting for her innocence, but for her dignity in front of strangers who did not know her, yet already leaned toward believing the worst. The judge, with eyes that seemed tired from years of hearing endless stories, shuffled through documents slowly, and every turn of a page echoed in her mind like the strike of a clock counting down to her fate. The whispers grew louder, not because anyone shouted, but because the small murmurs multiplied, creating a storm of judgment that wrapped around her, a sound that told her she was already seen as guilty by many, long before any verdict was given. She could feel her throat tighten, but she refused to bow her head, refused to show weakness, because deep inside her there was a strength she had built over years of struggle, a strength that told her to hold her ground no matter how heavy the air felt. She lifted her chin and fixed her eyes forward, steady and unbroken, and though fear still pressed hard against her chest, her stance carried a quiet defiance that unsettled those who watched, because it was not the posture of a guilty woman, but of someone who carried truth like armor. Every second dragged painfully, the ticking of the courtroom clock echoing in her ears, the judge's silence stretching like a test of endurance. And still she held on, reminding herself that lies might be loud, but truth, if carried with patience and strength, could rise above them. In that moment, though she felt the sting of judgment and the weight of accusation, she also became a figure of quiet suspense, the kind that made everyone lean closer, waiting to see whether she would break under the pressure or rise to prove that her innocence was stronger than any lie spoken against her. The courtroom was tense, every sound magnified in the silenced shuffle of shoes, the faint tapping of a pen, the slow exhale of someone in the back row, and in the middle of that stillness stood the woman, her chest tight with fear, yet her posture steady, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular, as though she had anchored herself to an invisible point to keep from drowning in the storm of judgment around her. Though her heart raced, she did not let her face show panic, for she knew that every expression would be studied, every flicker of weakness turned into proof for those eager to believe she was guilty, and so she chose silence, not the silence of defeat, but the silence of someone who refused to be broken by the weight pressing down on her. Whispers still curled through the air, some pitying, others sharp with suspicion, but her calm refusal to react to them began to unsettle those who had expected to see tears, shaking hands, or a crumbling figure unable to withstand the tension. Instead, her stillness became its own form of strength, a quiet message that she would not give her accusers the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. Even the man who had framed her shifted slightly in his chair, his earlier confidence no longer as solid, for he had counted on her collapse, had counted on her fear speaking louder than her truth. But now he watched a woman who stood like a wall, unyielding and waiting for her turn to speak. The jury members, too, glanced at her more carefully, their earlier certainty shaken by the composure that radiated from her, despite the heavy accusations, and some of them leaned back, as though reconsidering their first impressions, wondering what gave her such strength when most would have broken already. The judge's eyes, weary and sharp, lifted to study her longer than before, and though his face revealed nothing, the silence stretched, filled not with weakness but with a suspense that made even the air in the room feel heavy. Every second that passed without her trembling, every moment she stood rooted in quiet determination, became a silent challenge to those who thought they understood her, forcing them to see, not a fragile figure under pressure, but a woman holding on to a truth stronger than fear. And in that stillness, the atmosphere of the courtroom began to shift, slowly but surely, as her silence spoke louder than the whispers, unsettling her enemies and drawing the attention of those who had doubted. For her refusal to break was not just survival, it was the first spark of a strength that would soon turn the courtroom upside down. The silence of the courtroom broke when a man stepped forward, his voice firm and smooth, carrying the confidence of someone who believed his words would never be questioned. And as he began to speak, the entire room leaned toward him, eager to hear a story that seemed polished, sharp, and believable, with practiced pauses and convincing expressions. He painted the woman as guilty, describing actions she had never taken, twisting ordinary events into sinister shapes. And each sentence he spoke was like a stone thrown into the calm surface of the room, sending ripples of doubt into the minds of those listening. The jury members nodded faintly, their eyes narrowing as though they could already see her guilt, and even the judge's pen scratched across paper as though the words carried weight. The man's tone was steady, rehearsed, like someone who had repeated the story many times in his head until it became second nature. And because of his certainty, the audience began to believe that truth itself was standing in front of them, not lies. But beneath that calm exterior, the woman knew the truth. She could see the cracks behind his smooth words, the way his eyes avoided hers for too long, the way his hands gripped the edge of the stand tighter than he meant to. Small signs of strain hidden under layers of confidence. Still, the effect was powerful. The whispers grew again, this time sharper, carrying suspicion toward her, and she felt the cold weight of judgment pressing harder than before. For people often believe what sounds neat and perfect rather than what feels messy and complicated. And his story had been carefully designed to sound flawless. Yet, as she listened, silent but alert, her mind caught every twist he created, every detail that didn't match, storing them like weapons for the moment she would be allowed to speak. The suspense thickened, the air grew heavy as his words wrapped around the courtroom like chains, and for a time it seemed as if the room itself belonged to him. But deep within, she knew that truth, though buried, had its own quiet strength, and that sooner or later, the cracks in his testimony would show, because no lie, no matter how carefully dressed, could survive forever under the weight of reality. Inside the courtroom, while the weight of false accusations pressed heavily against her, the woman stood still, not with weakness, but with a calm determination that came from years of living through challenges most people in that room could never imagine. And as she listened to the man's confident lies echo through the air, she closed her eyes for a brief moment and reminded herself of the journey that had brought her to this very place, a journey carved by discipline, sacrifice, and an unshakable sense of service. She remembered long days when her body was pushed beyond exhaustion, when the only thing keeping her moving forward was the voice inside that whispered about duty and purpose. She remembered nights of training where silence was her companion and fear was an enemy she learned to master. These memories now served as armor, a reminder that strength was not always shown by shouting or forcing others to hear you, but by the steady resolve of standing your ground when the world tried to tear you down. She breathed slowly, her calm expression unsettling those who expected tears or anger, for they could not understand the kind of inner power she carried. Her silence was not weakness. It was the quiet power of someone who knew that storms pass and truth eventually finds its way through lies. As the courtroom leaned toward the man's testimony, she stood unmoved, a living contradiction to the picture he was trying to paint, her presence alone creating tension that words could not break. Beneath the surface of judgment and suspicion, a deeper story was waiting to be revealed, and in her silence and steady gaze, there was an unspoken promise that she was far more than the accusations thrown at her, and soon everyone would know. The moment finally came when the judge asked her to speak in her defense, and the courtroom, filled with restless whispers and doubtful stares, waited eagerly, expecting perhaps nervous words or desperate explanations. But instead, she moved slowly, with a calm that unsettled even those certain of her guilt, and slipped her hand into her pocket. Every eye followed as she pulled out a small object, and when she placed it on the wooden stand, the room seemed to freeze. A polished Navy SEAL badge glimmered under the courtroom lights, its silver edges catching the attention of all who looked. And for a breathless second, silence wrapped around everyone like a heavy blanket. The man who had been testifying against her faltered, his once confident face now marked with unease, for he knew the meaning of that emblem. It was not just a badge. It was proof of years of service, sacrifice, courage, and an unshakable commitment to truth and honor. The spectators leaned forward, disbelief etched on their faces as they realized the woman standing accused was not an ordinary figure to be dismissed, but someone who had endured trials most could never imagine. Even the judge's expression shifted, curiosity replacing indifference, and the jury exchanged nervous glances, no longer as sure of the story they had been fed. For the first time that night, the weight of the false claims began to crumble under the reality of who she was. And though she spoke no words yet, the badge spoke louder than anything she could have said. It told a story of bravery, discipline, and integrity that could not be erased by lies. And the silence that followed carried more power than any argument made before. This was the turning point, the moment when the tide began to shift. And everyone in that courtroom knew the truth was about to change everything. The badge rested on the stand like a quiet flame, its shine drawing every eye in the courtroom. And in that moment, the weight of the night shifted from accusation to revelation, for the small piece of metal was not just an ornament, but a living story of sacrifice, service, and battles fought in shadows far from the safety of those wooden benches. The people who had whispered about her guilt just moments before now sat frozen, their earlier certainty replaced by doubt, their eyes narrowing as if trying to see the truth they had ignored until now. The judge leaned slightly forward, his face betraying both curiosity and hesitation, while the man who had spoken confidently against her moments ago suddenly struggled to hold her gaze, his words faltering before they even reached his lips. The courtroom seemed to breathe differently, the silence pressing down heavier than the accusations ever had, because everyone realized they were no longer looking at a helpless woman, but at someone who had carried responsibilities greater than any of them could imagine. Inside, she stood steady, her calmness unshaken, because she knew this moment was not about pride, but about truth, finally stepping into the light. Years of discipline and courage were etched into that badge, and those who had doubted her now saw their own mistakes reflected back at them. The jurors shifted in their seats, some glancing at one another, as if silently questioning how they could have believed the false story presented against her, while others looked down, embarrassed by their earlier judgment. Even the nurse who had seemed dismissive earlier lowered her eyes, unable to meet the quiet strength that radiated from her presence. It was clear now that the narrative spun against her could no longer stand, because the badge itself spoke louder than any words, an undeniable symbol that carried honor, truth, and proof of a life lived with integrity. The false testimony that had once sounded convincing now seemed weak and hollow, crumbling under the weight of what she revealed without a single raised voice. The man who had framed her shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence unraveling as the badge's light seemed to strip away his lies one by one, leaving him exposed before the very people he had hoped to deceive. The judge's gavel had not yet fallen, no verdict had yet been read. But in that silence the tide had already turned, and everyone in the room knew it. She had not needed to argue, shout, or fight. For her truth had been carried in that small emblem all along, waiting for the right moment to be seen. The courtroom was no longer filled with doubt, but with a new kind of tension, one born from the realization that they had judged too quickly and too harshly, and now they were face to face with the undeniable power of truth. The silence that followed the gleam of the badge was unlike any the courtroom had felt before, thick and heavy, as if the walls themselves were listening. And in that silence the shift began, subtle at first, but undeniable as moments passed. The judge, who had earlier kept a distant and formal composure, now leaned slightly forward, his eyes no longer cold with detachment, but sharpened with curiosity and a trace of respect. The jurors, who had been sitting stiffly in neat rows, began to murmur quietly to one another, their whispers carrying doubt, surprise, and something that sounded like regret for having believed the accuser so easily. The accuser himself, once brimming with confidence, suddenly seemed to shrink under the weight of eyes no longer supporting him. His voice cracked when he tried to continue, and his words stumbled, losing the force they once carried. Around the room, people who had been quick to judge now shifted uneasily, their stares softening, some even lowering their gaze as though ashamed of the way they had joined in silent condemnation. The woman stood at the center of it all, steady and silent, her calmness more powerful than any outburst could have been, and her silence spoke volumes, telling them she did not need to prove her worth with words when her life's service had already spoken for her. Slowly, the doubt that had once clung to her began to dissolve, and in its place grew respect, reluctant at first but gathering strength with each passing moment, until it filled the room like an invisible tide. It was no longer the story of a helpless woman being accused, but the story of someone whose quiet dignity was undoing lies one by one. Every small glance exchanged between jurors, every thoughtful crease on the judge's forehead, every falter in the accuser's voice was evidence that the balance was shifting in her favor, not through force, not through anger, but through the undeniable truth of who she was and what she represented. The room once filled with whispers of judgment, now carried whispers of admiration and doubt aimed not at her but at the one who had tried to frame her. And though no verdict had been spoken yet, it was clear to everyone present that the tide of the trial had already turned. The moment finally came when she chose to speak, and when her voice filled the courtroom, it was not sharp with anger nor broken with fear, but calm, steady, and clear, carrying a weight that silence alone could not hold. Her words were simple, without fancy language or dramatic tones, yet they carried a power that drew every ear toward her, for there was no trace of panic, only truth, and the quiet confidence of someone who had lived through storms far greater than false accusations. She explained her innocence without begging for pity, without pointing fingers, and without raising her voice, but instead, by calmly showing how the story against her was built on weak shadows rather than solid ground. She reminded them gently but firmly that appearances could deceive, that it was easy to assume guilt when one only looked at the surface. Yet actions and choices over time revealed who a person truly was. Her life, her service, and her sacrifice stood as proof far stronger than any words her accuser could fabricate. And though she did not list her accomplishments as trophies, the quiet dignity with which she spoke made everyone in the room recall the badge glinting on the stand and what it represented. The jury leaned closer, some nodding subtly, while the judge kept his gaze fixed on her, listening with the kind of attention that suggested her words were striking deeper than any legal argument had done all day. Even the accuser shifted uncomfortably, for her calm truth made his earlier confidence seem loud, hollow, and fragile. She did not shout that she was innocent, she explained it, piece by piece, as though placing bricks of honesty on top of each other until they formed a wall no lie could climb. Her voice carried a strange balance of gentleness and unshakable resolve, and it reached the hearts of those who, moments earlier, had doubted her. Suspense hung in the air, not in fear of whether she would break, but in wonder at how much strength she could reveal through such measured words. When she finished, the silence returned, yet this time it was not filled with doubt or whispers against her. It was filled with thought, with reflection, and with the slow realization that they were not only hearing the defense of an innocent woman, but the voice of integrity itself. A voice that could not be faked, could not be rehearsed, and could not be ignored. The courtroom, which only moments before had been filled with tension and doubt, now shifted as her words lingered in the air like an unshakable truth no one could deny, and it became clear that the accusations which had weighed so heavily upon her had begun to collapse, not with noise or sudden drama, but with the steady crumble of lies exposed by light. The badge on the stand gleamed under the overhead lamps, not as a decoration, but as a reminder of service, sacrifice, and honor, and its presence made every false word spoken against her sound even weaker than before. The man who had testified so confidently earlier now found his voice faltering, his once straight shoulders beginning to bend as the cracks in his story grew too wide to ignore. The jury exchanged looks, some whispering softly, their pens no longer taking notes because the truth had become so clear it needed no more writing. The judge leaned back, his expression thoughtful, watching the accuser with the sharp eyes of someone who now recognized the difference between confidence and deceit. Each detail she had spoken lined up with reality, while each claim the man had made began to unravel when examined against her steady words and the unshakable symbol beside her. The courtroom no longer looked at her with suspicion. Their gazes turned instead to the man who had tried to trap her in his web of lies. His hands fidgeted, his mouth opened, but found no convincing words to fill the silence. And the respect that once seemed is now slipped away, like sand through fingers. Suspense hung thick, not because anyone doubted her innocence now, but because they were watching justice take shape before their very eyes, step by step, as if truth itself had risen in the room and demanded to be seen. The lies that had once seemed strong collapsed like a house built on air, and as the courtroom watched the man stumble over his own broken claims, there was no doubt left that he had been exposed. His attempt to frame her now, nothing but a public failure. The weight that had pressed so heavily against her began to lift, not in a rush, but with the slow, steady certainty of a dawn breaking after a long night, and everyone present knew they had witnessed not just a defense, but the restoration of justice itself. The trial ended with the gavel striking, yet the echo of that moment did not fade with the sound, for it was not just another case closed, but a story that would live far beyond the walls of the courtroom. A story of one woman who had faced judgment, lies, and doubt, yet stood her ground with a courage so quiet it spoke louder than any raised voice ever could. People left the courthouse whispering, not about guilt or scandal, but about the way she had revealed truth without aggression, how she had let her strength show, not through anger, but through discipline, patience, and the undeniable weight of her badge. A symbol that carried history, service, and honor within its polished metal. Her image remained in the minds of those who watched the calm stance, the steady voice, the unshaken eyes that seemed to hold more power than any accusation hurled against her. Even those who had doubted her at first found themselves telling the story later with respect, repeating how she had not argued like others might have, but had instead placed the truth in front of everyone and let it shine until lies could no longer hide in its light. The accuser's fall was remembered, but not as much as her rise. It was her resolve that filled conversations in homes, in offices, and among strangers who had only read of the trial in papers the next day. It became a reminder that truth, though often tested, does not break, and that real authority is not shown through dominance, but through calm strength. Days turned to weeks, yet people still recalled the trial, retelling it as an example of integrity, proof that one person's honesty could stand against a tide of deceit and win. Too many. She became more than a defendant, cleared of charges. She became a symbol of resilience, of courage, in silence, of what it meant to trust in truth, even when the world seemed blind to it. And though the courtroom emptied and life moved forward, the memory of that night remained like a flame carried from one person to another, growing brighter each time it was spoken, until the woman who once stood alone under judgment became remembered not for the accusations she faced, but for the strength she revealed when it mattered most.